So I haven't done one of these in a while, and I thought since I've recently covered Halo Infinite over on the IGN channel, and obviously a more deeper look at the PC and all the console versions, multiplayer and single player on my channel, which will be up now or very, very soon, I wanted to wrap it up with one look back at the original reveals of Halo Infinite, how it's changed, how it's improved, how it's degraded, and whether or not we should all be panicking and waving our fists in the air at these angry downgrades. Now, as before, there's obviously many things that can happen in that period of time with the development. Not everything is negative. Changes happen for various reasons, and I'll cover that a little here and comparing it. So obviously this is around 2 years or just over from the original reveal, and there's a lot to discuss. So as we start off with this original fade into the cinematic, we can see instant changes to the character model himself. He's nowhere near as detailed. The eyes, the hair, the face, some of those are obviously artistic changes, but overall the depth of field, the post-processing in this shot has been significantly reduced. Look at his hand and the background as it fades in a depth filter, the depth of field bokeh shapes, all of that is gone, and now it's a cheap, very limited Gaussian filter that goes from the foreground to the background, and it stands out as quite a cheap solution compared to the original expensive one they used in this pre-rendered footage. And obviously the actual shading itself on the textures, the skin, the face, the hair, they're all significantly cheaper than they were in this original in-engine reveal. As is the light sources, you can see here that the alpha transparencies sample the light source, which they don't on the retail release. It wasn't targeting Series X, it was far, far too soon. Likelihood the target was to do this and obviously do it on Xbox One X as well, but they've made sacrifices here to get the game to launch, not just in these cinematics as I cover in my original review. So overall, once we move into this section, you can instantly see there's some improvements. The light source here in this new shot is much better. It's on his face. You can see better detail on his textures and the skin. Some of that is around the quality of the capture I've got from the original reveal, but overall, the lighting construction here is very good. But once he falls back, we again see a mixture. That soft penumbra feathered edge shadow is gone, but the light calculations of blue and red is also gone. But you do get that additional benefit now of a shadow casting light source, which actually improves the depth of the scene. It looks less flat, but overall, there's still less light sources, less alpha, and overall less tone mapping being used here. Again, this is borne out by the fact that his little transceiver there, looking at his message from his wife and his child, is a completely different model. Almost certainly this is a very hand bespoke offline animation built into this game and then played almost like a video playback as a canned animation. This is no longer the case in the final retail version. I'm using the Xbox One X here, not even the Series X, which is generally no different to the Xbox One X here, aside a small increase in resolution and performance. You can see that the polygonal character is much lower quality, much less detail, and obviously the depth of field and the post-processing is pared back. You'll also see that there's that lack of subsurface scattering on his skin, showing the texture details and the assets just there. As I pause it, you can see that red light beaming through his fingertips. It doesn't appear on the new version, the retail version, because that's an expensive cost and they did not factor that in. You can see that his beard is actually quite close, the face, the hair, the shading overall is actually pretty close at this point. The changes on the previous model are likely down to artistic changes. They've shortened his haircut, made it more military, which is obviously less so in the original reveal, and here they've got much closer to that original character model. But you can definitely see the big sacrifices in the eyes, the pupils, the parallax depth, the specular highlights, very, very expensive elements, eyes for rendering, and obviously it's where all the life is. So the difference here between the original version and the version here is all down to those subtle elements which make the character look less dynamic. Although the over-egged animation is still there, they've subtly pared it back slightly in the final game, but it's still over-animated in my opinion. Once we move into the ship, we can see this first shot here, big difference in terms of design and structure. You can see that Master Chief doesn't actually have a grapple hook attached to his hand, which he does in the final retail. So it shows at this point they likely didn't have or had no intention of including that in the game itself. So it didn't come that far into the development process, but likely 2 years in. Now, I know the game was in development for 6 years, but it clearly wasn't. Pre-production is a thing. This obviously had a troubled development, as I've already mentioned, so there's definitely clear signs here that the game had a 3-year gestation in development. You can see some improvements on the texture details on the ground, much better in the retail version, as is the Master Chief himself. The actual armor he's wearing, the dents, the damage, the scuffs, the scrapes, all of that looks much better in the retail version. But here you can see the sacrifice in the light sources. That directional light source that's pointed at them both is heavily pared back, has hardly any shadow casting light sources on it. It gives a lot of depth in that pre-rendered version here, or the reveal that we can see here. Again, volumetrics are used more heavily. Those depth of field sample shapes are much better. They're not using like a stencil cutout, they're actually part of the depth buffer. You can see those bokeh shapes just popping up on his hands and the particles there. It's just much cheaper, although the skin is better here on the retail version than it is on the reveal version. And then beyond this, you can see the sacrifices in terms of geometry. So there's definitely less polygonal construction on the tubes in the background, the cables on the floor, and overall it's a flatter scene. There's more volumetric, but there's less depth of field. The quality is lower, and again, it can be shimmery the lower resolution is. This cutscene is vastly different. The grapple hook here doesn't retract because, again, it wasn't there. Again, the improvements on the light on his hands, the specular, the Fresnel edge as it casts across the glove of his hand, all of that is actually better in the retail version. But beyond this, he puts the chip in steps forward, and again, you can see subtle differences in the construction, which leads me to believe that this was a render target before the game was anywhere near in a production state, and therefore they've used this to build the final game. That's borne out by the end of the video. You know, he's already got a gun on him, he doesn't take it from the pilot, the whole animation is different, the camera layouts are different, and then he jumps off the back of the ship. It's all vastly different to what we get in the final release, but it is a good indication that this was very early in the development cycle. Something different a year later when we finally saw the title and game we compare in gameplay.
There's nothing left for us here. I don't think part here is. No, not then! Not again! We need to run!
No, we need a fight.
Exactly 1 year later, we got real gameplay, definitely on real hardware at this point. It's very close. Those bokeh shapes are definitely gone, but the improvements to the beard on the fins themselves are much better. Now more dithered, the transparencies are more refined, and overall the image quality of the character model here, it's definitely the same build, the same rig, the same animation structure. They've just pared back some of the animation elements in terms of just reducing the overemphasis on that exaggerated style. Now there is other differences here because the time of day, likely the time of day wasn't working in this reveal in E3 2020. So they're able to light this or hand place those light sources, which they would have done in the retail version, but it's definitely different. You can see the light shadow casting on his face, the light across his eyes, a little bit of a Spielberg touch there. But in the background, you can see the shadows on Master Chief's armor as he puts his hand in the air. It's not there on the reveal version. So there's definitely a different construction of light sources. Again, the bokeh shapes in the background with the particle system doesn't come in on the reveal version. It comes in, and then here, when it fades out, you see it come in just there. So it's definitely using similar bokeh shapes in certain points of the cinematics, but again, it doesn't look like they're culling this now for performance reason. These do look like genuine artistic changes. There's volumetric light sources here, a fog volume around the area they're talking, and that looks much better. It's a little bit overbloomed in the background, and you can see that opaque look on Master Chief's visor is subtly different as well. It's far too shiny with a little bit of diffuse elements and then reflection, which there is on the original reveal, so that does look like a change. But you can see those fog volumes there in the background. It's very low quality compared to the reveal, so they've definitely reduced those over that original target version. Again, you can bump this up a little on PC, but it doesn't make much of a difference. It's certainly not on the level we're seeing on the left hand side here. And then you can see that change in that Fresnel lighting just around the edge, as I mentioned in my original preview, both on the Master Chief and the pilot here. But his beard is better overall. The other big change is obviously the time of day is completely different. It's much lower sun, almost like a foggy morning with all that haze in the background. And again, that's artistic changes. Along with the fact that now there's no grass, there's no area around here. It's very barren and dirt and muddy, and that's a very different look to what it was on the original reveal. But again, that's an artistic change. I do prefer Master Chief's armor here. It's far more detailed. It looks better, and the way he walks out into the light is a much better construction. And then we get into some big improvements. So as I covered originally with the gun details, it's very flat, very bland, not a lot of decals, no micro facets really. All of that has been significantly improved here. The light reaction on his glove, on the Master Chief's glove itself, the gun itself, the yellow strip, the little switches and dials on the actual gun itself, all of that looks much better. You can see a big improvement here on this crashed ship. Look at the material, the rust, the dirt, the dents, all of that catches that light and gives those microfacet subsurface details across the area, so the light diffuses over them and gives that depth to the surface. None of that is present on the original reveal. It's definitely improved, and it certainly looks better, but there are other changes. Again, you've got to take into account that time of day. That dynamic time of day will have a difference, along with those volumetric clouds in the distance can change the construction of certain scenes. But like I surmised at the time, using image-based lighting, this is how they've got this result. As we get into the Jeep here, you can see the improved detail and textures on the Jeep itself. The fact that this is no longer like a bog, a swamp, it's now like a little mini lake. And as you pull up here and look at the rock surface, you can see the improvement in the details. Look at the rocks in the background. They've added additional polygonal construction here, better composites, that mist in the background. The construction of the scene is better, that Fresnel lighting around the edge of the truck, the diffused elements of the metal itself, all of that looks much better, as does the grass and the rocks. As you drive down here, the popping is similar, but the time of day is almost the same as well. That light bloom, that haze in the background gives that atmospheric scattering look. The mud is definitely less specular, more diffuse here, and I actually prefer it, but overall once you get into this combat section it's still as dark and flat as before. As I covered in my original preview, they don't use a lot of point lights, directional lights, and light sources as a whole, dynamic light sources, are very lacking, like these laser blasts here which don't have anything on them which previous Halo titles did. They have added in that specular muzzle flash now on the assault rifle, which again shows they are making improvements, but they're not drastic ones in terms of the overall presentation. Considering it's been around 18 months, there are improvements to texture quality, details you can see here. Some of the assets have been improved. One of the biggest things that I complained about in the original preview though are still present. There are good animation sets, but the blending's bad. The physics interaction, the way the physics kicks in on death is very flat, leaving very almost comical death still in the title, and they don't have much punch when people get shot and die. There are points when you can shoot them in the legs and arms and they spin around, certainly the grunts, but the heavier brutes, they don't tend to have that much weight to them, so it makes the combat a little less satisfying with such a big enemy. AI is poor and they can kill themselves, and generally it lacks that punch it should have. Once you go up the lift here, you can see they've made artistic improvements across the board, better placement of those billboard lights. The difference in that dynamic time of day certainly makes a change, but overall the materials and the structure here are almost identical. The birds fly off at the same point, the ship flies in overhead as you turn. And they've certainly improved the metallic reflective materials of surfaces. So you can see there the screen space reflections are significantly better. They've improved the light incidence on that diffused reflection, giving objects a more noisy stochastic drop-off, that contact hardening towards reflective sources better in that SSR pass. And therefore brush metals, reflective metals, high specular, diffuse reflections, all of those look better in a lot of objects. And we see this across this combat section, but it's still let down by very flat, opaque visual effects, alpha effects that don't have a lot of particle mixing. They don't blend well within the scene. They don't, again, have all those point lights which I mentioned, which they lack heavily throughout the title. There are some artistic changes. They've certainly improved the fog volumes around some of the light sources. They look to have improved the light sources and point lights in certain explosions, definitely. They've made as many changes within the 18 months they had. There's certainly a lot more they could have done, but again, a lot of these are artistic changes, and it really kind of comes to the fore again when you get into this gun turret, turn around and shoot. Even with a different set in the sun, it's still a flat scene, again because of those flat, heavy, opaque alpha effects, the lack of any contact shadows from a lot of dynamic characters, dynamic light sources overall, and the material system really comes to the fore here. Everything reacts very similar to the light sources, and that's what really lets it down. There's not a lot of contrast and depth. It's certainly better than the original reveal, but not what it should or could have been for a tentpole title like Halo.
Take care of the cannon.
Aside that, there are some other subtle changes to sound mixing, but overall that's the end of this analysis. Using a mixture of the Series X and the Xbox One X, we can see that the original cinematic reveal was drastically reduced in terms of the final retail version. Certainly in specific areas, it's very close, but it certainly shows it was a target render for the specifications of the Xbox One X. The gameplay reveal in 2020 is obviously significantly closer, running on genuine hardware at the time, and here we can see in the Series X, it's still very close to that original reveal. It has been improved in some specific areas, some that are probably hard to spot as I've covered here, some that stand out a little better, but overall it's a better output than the original reveal. But for 18 months there's not been a huge amount of improvement, but then again we didn't see the state of the entire game behind the scenes, so I'm pretty sure there's much more to that conversation than what we've just covered here. But for now, I'm out. Remember, I do this as a part-time thing. If you guys and girls like what I do here, please hit that subscribe because that really helps. Share this where appropriate and leave a comment down below. Leave your thoughts and feedbacks. Did you like Halo Infinite? Were you impressed with it? Do you think they did a much better job in getting close to that target? Have I just waffled on here and you ignore me anyway? Like I say, gameplay is the most important part of a game, but my channel is technology related, so please don't start talking about how good the gameplay is because that's not the point of this channel predominantly. I do talk about gameplay. It absolutely makes a big part, and games should be fun first and foremost, but if you are just going to comment around the fact that the gameplay is amazing, therefore I'm an idiot, that's kind of missing the point. Anyway, I've got a plane to catch. I'll catch you on the next one.